Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice Podcast, episode 314. I'm your host, Ohio pharmacist Kim Newlove. Among other things, I help pharmacists start podcasts, and today we are talking about 8 podcast names that you could use. To my knowledge, nobody's using any of these podcast names yet, so feel free to take one and get started. And hey, if you need any help getting started with a podcast, you can check out my podcasting resources on kimnewlove.com/podcasting. I'll have a link to that in the episode description there in your podcast player, or you can go to the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. Let's get right to it. I will list all 8 podcast names first, and then we'll talk about them all one at a time. Number 1, the Pharmacy Confessional. Number 2, the Island Pharmacist. Number 3, Pharmacist Parents Podcast. Number 4, Poison Prevention Podcast. Number 5, Retired Pharmacists Podcast. Number 6, Board of Pharmacy Podcast, for example, the Ohio Board of Pharmacy Podcast. Number 7, the Student Pharmacist Podcast, for students by students. And number 8, the Bilingual Pharmacist Podcast. That does it for the list of 8. I'm not stopping there. Let me give you a little bit of an idea of what I had in mind for each of those 8 podcasts, starting with the Pharmacy Confessional. For the Pharmacy Confessional, I'm thinking this would be hosted by a retail pharmacist who is bothered by certain aspects of the retail pharmacy setting, and they want to get stuff off their chest, either something from a patient interaction or working with another pharmacist or things that doctors do that are very interesting to us as pharmacists, or maybe something that happened with a student. Or this could be an interview show, or it could be a solo and interview show combined. Anyways, with the interview shows, this host could be interviewing other pharmacists, whether they're in the retail setting or another setting, and just asking them, what's something that bothers you about your job? Or what's something that's bothered you about reimbursement or working with a certain other healthcare provider? It's the Pharmacy Confessional. And this one could be kind of fun where you disguise the voices. So you never really know the host's name or the guests' names. It could be kind of fun. When you hear the Pharmacy Confessional, it really perks your ears up, doesn't it? All right, let's move on to number 2, the Island Pharmacist. The Island Pharmacist could be many different things. I'll just throw out 2 ideas. I'm thinking of Hawaii, or I'm thinking of the Lake Erie Islands here in Ohio. Both settings are islands, right? So Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, right? They have their own set of interesting things that happen on the island. Or they can talk about all the cool things that they get to do after work because they live in paradise. Or if they live in Northwest Ohio, they can talk about how you have to get months' worth of supplies on the island before the lake freezes and you can't really get across very easily for a few months. Listening to other pharmacists' perspectives gives you some insights about what you can appreciate about living on the mainland. Very interesting idea. The Island Pharmacist Podcast. All right, let's move on to number 3, Pharmacist Parents Podcast. The Pharmacist Parents Podcast. Not just dads, not just moms. This is pharmacist parents. These may even be grandparents raising grandchildren, and they happen to be pharmacists. Any person who is a pharmacist and a parent could be part of this podcast, either running the podcast and doing solo shows or doing interview shows. And this podcast could help parents with advice from getting pregnant to managing a pregnancy while standing 8 to 10 hours on their feet, or managing maternity leave. How did they deal with it? Did they do 6 weeks, 12 weeks, even more? Did they take a year off? Did they go part-time afterwards? What's it like to put a kid in daycare and then go work at a pharmacy? What is it like to miss your kids' activities? What's it like trying to schedule family vacations? There's all kinds of just commonalities that we as parents experience in life, and that could all go into the Pharmacist Parents Podcast. Number 4 is the Poison Prevention Podcast. This would be Poisoning Cases, presented by a pharmacist who is a specialist in poison information, also known as a SPI, S-P-I, SPI, a specialist in poison information. I love poison prevention education and all topics poison prevention, so I think it would be really interesting to hear about when things went wrong and how could that have been prevented. The Poison Prevention Podcast. Number 5 is the Retired Pharmacists podcast. Oh my gosh, I want to be a retired pharmacist someday, and I bet you do too. So I would recommend that a retired pharmacist, of course, start this podcast and talk about what they love about being retired and interview other retired pharmacists about if they found it hard to give up their license, if they found it hard to retire, things they're able to do in retirement. Give us something to look forward to, guys. Somebody create the Retired Pharmacists podcast. Number 6 is the Board of Pharmacy podcast. Now, I made this one purposely vague because, of course, we have 50 states in the United States, plus Puerto Rico and Guam, I believe. Those are a couple of our territories here in the States. I think every single board of pharmacy needs to have their own podcast, and I'll tell you why. As an Ohio pharmacist, our state board of pharmacy does a great job of communicating in print, but I don't have a lot of time to just sit around and read things, but I care about learning what is new in the profession of pharmacy here in the state of Ohio. So I propose that the Ohio Board of Pharmacy create the Ohio Board of Pharmacy podcast. Number 7 is the Student Pharmacist podcast. For students, by students. I know there's more than 100 colleges of pharmacy around the United States, but the whole point behind this is that this would give pharmacy students a podcast to listen to that's just for them and created by them. The host would be a pharmacy student. They could interview pharmacy students from all the different colleges of pharmacy around the United States and find out what the similarities are, what the differences are, what can we all learn from each other. The Student Pharmacist podcast could be great for students. And then the 8th and final podcast name that I threw out was the Bilingual Pharmacist podcast. We could have a pharmacist host this and talk about how very helpful it can be to speak a second language, whether it's French or Spanish or one of the European languages or even an African dialect. I'm sure that there are amazing stories of how helpful they have been to people from around the world just by speaking a second language. The Bilingual Pharmacist podcast. And that does it for my list of 8 podcast names that you could use. I hope you enjoyed the list and maybe that whet your appetite for starting your own podcast here in 2025. Thank you for joining me for episode 314 of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. To find the show notes, go to thepharmacistvoice.com, click the podcast tab, and pick episode 314. In the show notes, you will find this lovely list of 8 podcast names that you could use, a link to my podcasting resources on kimnewlove.com/podcasting, my social media links, and more. If you know someone who would like to start a podcast and needs a name for it, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, come on back. We've got lots more coming up here in 2025. Subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist's Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thanks for listening today. I will talk to you next week.